All right, welcome. Thank you all for coming, taking time out of your day to be here. The purpose of today's event is for Erik to give us a historical presentation on what the actual plans would have been for Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of England. And from that, we will figure out how we're going to play it on tabletop here in a couple of months. So it's really good to get this because it's a battle that most of us have probably never even heard of until very recently and still know little about. So hopefully Erik is going to fill in and give us a good knowledge base to move from. Erik, of course, has been here previously. He briefed us up on the Battle of the Bulge, Battle for Kursk, Stalingrad, the breakout from Normandy, number presentation. This will be the second one we're filming and keeping today to put on the YouTube channel. So we're really happy about that. Thanks to Richard for filming it for us. Anyway, Erik has been my good friend for many, many years. He's a platform instructor at Fort Rucker, Alabama, with the United States Army Aviation School and Warrant Officer Academy. So with a warm welcome, let's welcome Erik Kaempfer.
Thank you. Appreciate it. All right. Hey, glad to be back. As Jake said, been here a couple of times before. Always enjoy giving a presentation. I think these things always work better when you have a little bit of the historical context, the picture, if you will, in which these battles or campaigns took place. And hopefully that's my intent. That's what I would like to provide for you today. It's sort of battles in isolation, you don't really understand the decisions that were made. Why did leaders come up with decisions or non-decisions of why something did or didn't happen? So again, my idea is hopefully to give you sort of the macro view, if you will, in which this operation was planned. I can't say that the operation was conducted because, as we know, Sea Lion was not conducted. With that in mind, it's very interesting when something is done in wartime. You have a battle or you have a campaign, it becomes history. It's a past event. So you can look back on what actually occurred. You can think about what could have occurred, obviously, but there is a historical record there of something that did actually happen. In the case of Sea Lion, there's more speculation involved because it was planned, never actually executed. So the historical record is a little bit more murky than for some things that were actually created. I found that the historians that I consulted, many different works and so on, they have some differing opinions about exactly what did the Germans mean by planning this or that or something in the operation that would have probably been clear had it have been attempted, but it wasn't. So there's it does allow some interesting fuel for additional speculation about would they actually have tried that, or was it just something they bluffed on, or was it a plan? Was it not a plan? Something of that nature. So it does make it a little bit more interesting. But it also should generate some more discussion generally, because again, we can talk about the different aspects of what the Germans were intending to do, and of course what the British were planning to do to defend against it. But there is no real right or wrong answer here, so it should be quite interesting. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started with Unternehmen Seelove. Here's the outline we'll follow. Again, look at the strategic situation, essentially at the time of the Battle of France. As we know, we'll go over that quite briefly so that we set up the situation between essentially Hitler and Churchill upon the capitulation of France and the decisions or what they were faced with as far as their next moves would be. We'll look at the early planning for Sea Lion. Then, of course, once the decision was made by Hitler to go ahead with planning for Sea Lion and initiate the preparations, what do the various armed forces or branches of the Wehrmacht do in order to prepare to execute Hitler's ideas? Of course, then we need to look at the defense. What do the English, or as the Germans would call them, or the British, plan to do to defend against a possible invasion? What was the final plan, or at least, again, you have to qualify this because many of the details of Sea Lion, even toward the end of August or into September of 1940, were still in flux. There were certain things that still weren't nailed down. So there is a little bit of speculation, but by that point, they had a compromise plan, essentially, that could have been executed. And of course, the final question is the one on everyone's mind that looks at this, that historians have been wrestling with, of course. And there's many opinions on this as anything else. So we can discuss that a little bit as well. What if Hitler had pulled the trigger? what would have happened? Again, it's you're talking about something that didn't occur, so it's the field's really wide open on that. So we'll get to talk about that. All right, so we'll start with the strategic situation. As you probably were, on 10 May, this initiated the German campaign, or initiated the Battle of France, their campaign in the west through Belgium and the northern part of France. On the day that the battle began, by coincidence, Churchill becomes Prime Minister of Great Britain, replacing Neville Chamberlain. During the Battle of France, if you're not otherwise aware, of course, everyone knows the famous breakthrough in the Ardennes forest, primarily by General Rommel, who, of course, later is going to go to even greater fame in North Africa. Leads his forces here through the breakout across the Meuse River and races for the coast, essentially trapping or encircling both the majority of the French army and, of course, the British Expeditionary Force there against the coast. We're all, again, familiar with the story. Once they reach the coast and begin to move the forces toward Dunkirk, we have the famous evacuation at Dunkirk. Of course, originally, Churchill and those did not think they would get more than 50,000 troops off of the beaches of Dunkirk before the Germans completely eliminated the beachhead. As we know, it was much more successful than that. And approximately 338,000 total soldiers were evacuated off of that. Somehow, somewhere the French kind of get forgotten when we talk about Dunkirk. We think of it as almost an exclusive English show, but it wasn't. As you can see, almost a third of the troops that were rescued off of the Dunkirk beaches were actually French troops at the time. Now, Churchill, of course, used the evacuation of Dunkirk as a very powerful propaganda tool, if you will, particularly when he announced the results in the House of Commons. Again, everyone was thinking that almost no troops would come off, or very few, maybe a few tens of thousands might actually be rescued. So there was a tremendous, I guess you'd say, exhilaration and joyous, cheering, if you will, when they found out that more than 300,000 troops had actually been saved. But as Churchill then said, of course, that's wonderful. It's almost a miracle. However, he had the phrase, "We still have a long war ahead of us, and wars are not won by evacuations." So he understood that even though a majority of the British Expeditionary Force had been saved, England itself was in a very precarious strategic position at this particular time. They had lost the battle. They had been thrown off the continent. And now Hitler, against all odds, is master of Western Europe. The troops came back, but the equipment did not. All right. This just gives you a rough thumbnail sketch of the fact that there was obviously no way for the British, with that available fleet, that somewhat ragtag fleet, to pull the heavy equipment of the army back off the coast. So again, this just gives you a small idea of the percentages. And when we say percentages of tank strength and artillery strength, we don't mean of the BEF, we mean of the British Army as a whole. That's how much of their heavy equipment they had to leave behind or was destroyed or captured by the Germans. You see the enormous amount of ammunition, the enormous amount of fuel, and of course the enormous number of vehicles, which the Wehrmacht said, "Thank you very much." The vehicles were incorporated directly into their forces. And we would see many of those again in Barbarossa. They were used in the invasion of the Soviet Union. For the casualties, it was 17% of the BEF itself became either killed, wounded, or missing during the Battle of France. Again, and the loss of almost 800 tanks were left behind. So again, from an immediate point of view, these losses of equipment are catastrophic from the English point of view. It would take a long time to rebuild or reconstitute the equipment side of the British Army. So where does that leave England at this particular point? It is sometimes not noted that for a few days, and there are some interesting historical write-ups on this, Churchill and his cabinet, his war cabinet in particular, actually discussed or brought up the idea of negotiating with Hitler. We tend to think of Churchill as, we'll never surrender, the beaches, the hills, so on, many of his famous rousing speeches that he gave in the House of Commons. Those occurred a little bit later. Originally, when they were at the depths of despair, It was right about this time. Of course, this is immediately after France has surrendered. And this is also only when the evacuation from Dunkirk had immediately been initiated, but they did not know yet how many troops they would pull off. And again, they still had those pessimistic figures in their head. Churchill and individuals such as his Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax, Neville Chamberlain is still part of the War, the War Council or the War Cabinet. Lord Halifax, in particular, was in favor of at least initiating negotiations with Hitler. That didn't really mean he was a defeatist, but he said, let's talk to him. If we don't like the terms, we can always fight later. We don't have to surrender first. We can have the discussion, so to speak. So for 3 or 4 days there in the latter part of May, the Churchill and the others discussed this. What would it be beneficial for us to maybe negotiate with Hitler? Obviously, as we know, at the end of the day, Churchill turned against the idea pretty rapidly within a day or two, and he became very forceful about it, and essentially he won the cabinet over to his position that they were not going to talk or entertain any kind of negotiations with Hitler at all. Basically, Churchill's argument was, we're not going to get any better terms if we negotiate than if we fight and get defeated, so we might as well fight it out. He said, there's no point. We won't get a better deal. We might as well fight. So some of the, you can see some of the other ideas that Churchill had that would be a detriment or against negotiating with Hitler. Number one, he thought it would be a morale buster for the English people. If word ever got out that they were entertaining the idea of cutting a deal with Hitler, he was afraid that, the English people basically would become defeatists and they would not want to defend the island. Why am I going to die on the beaches if my leaders are negotiating with the enemy anyway? That kind of thing. So from morale point of view. Also, somewhat, obviously, as we know, erroneously, Churchill had in his idea that FDR and the United States were going to rapidly enter the war, probably within a couple of months. As we know from history, that's not true. It was over a year after that before the U.S. entered the war directly. And of course, that was because of the attack on Pearl Harbor. The catalyst was not in Europe, it was in the Pacific. But Churchill had it in his head, if you will, that help was just around the corner. The U.S. was about to enter the war, so we can't negotiate now. If we hold out for a few months, the U.S. will be in the war. Of course, little does he know, it's going to be quite a few months later before the U.S. actually does that. And of course, he talked about the English, and of course, Churchill talked about, now we stand alone against Hitler. Because the Soviet Union is during this particular time is I guess you could say neutral, if you will. The Nazi-Soviet pact is still in effect, so they haven't entered the war yet either. They would not until Barbarossa the following year. So, however, England has a worldwide empire, the Commonwealth, and forces from the Commonwealth, particularly Canada and Australia, are already sending aid and forces to the English homeland at this particular time. Very soon after this, within a few days, the 1st Canadian Infantry Division will arrive and become part of the purported English defense against sea line should it have occurred. Also, New Zealander units were beginning to show up, and eventually Australian units would come. So they did have some assistance, if you will, or some help from their Commonwealth as well. What are the German options now? You think, well, it'd be a lot better to be on the German side than the English side because the English are still standing, but they really have no strategic options other than to try to reconstitute their forces and wait and see what happens. You would think, well, Hitler is master of Europe. He can do whatever he wants. Well, he certainly has many more strategic options than Churchill does, but in some way, this seemed to induce a type of paralysis at the top of the German hierarchy, if you will. There were so many options, he wasn't really sure what to do. He did not really, apparently, want to invade England. That would have been his last resort. He would much rather negotiate with England and come to some kind of an arrangement. Hitler betrays a tremendous ambivalence about England. He hates them one moment. He wants to be allied with them the next moment. He had a dream about the Nazi Empire ruling Europe and the English, worldwide Commonwealth essentially staying intact. They could be partners, all this kind of stuff. So it was really hard to figure out exactly what Hitler is going on with on this particular point. But he has no particular plan at this moment in time on what to do next. The victory over France was so rapid and overwhelming, it sort of caught the entire German high command at a loss. They had no idea it would be so successful so rapidly. And it's sort of like I always joke about, the dog that chases the car all the time. What happened if he caught it? Well, what do I do now? So he sort of caught the car, if you will, but now Hitler doesn't really know what to do with it. He's not sure. So there's drift and inconsistency. He's kind of jumping from one idea to the next, and of course his leadership has to wait for his guidance on what they're supposed to do. He offers peace. You've probably seen he makes speeches and so on. About the war's over. It's time for England to give up. You need to come to terms. So on and so forth. He makes peace offers, but the problem is that Hitler isn't really offering a compromise of any kind. He wants what they call a victor's peace. I want to negotiate with you, but you start out with you lose and I win, and I get to dictate the terms. That's his idea of a compromise. Okay. He's not willing to give up anything. A compromise is what? Each side does what? Gives up something so that you meet in the middle. He isn't willing to do that. He wants all the compromise to come from the English side. And of course, this is the genesis of why Churchill said, he's not offering us anything better if we talk to him than if we fight him. So why in the heck are we going to talk to him? We should fight him. So no concessions are actually offered by Hitler. And his mind is already beginning to drift to another opponent. Who is that? The USSR. He's already thinking at this early point in the summer of 1940 about his true plan is, of course, to go to the east and create or invade the Soviet Union in the operation that will become Barbarossa the following year. Yeah, he also is looking for some additional allies. He's at the height of his power, as height of his influence in Europe. So, in particular, he wants to talk to Spain, and he also wants to talk to what will become Vichy France, because at this particular time, the German army occupies the northern part of France, but he creates the Vichy government, the puppet government of France, that essentially has the southern part of France. So the country is divided in two. He conducts negotiations at a diplomatic level with both Franco, the leader of Spain, fascist Spain, which of course he has done what? He assisted in the Spanish Civil War to win, and also with Vichy France to not be a neutral, but to enter the war wholeheartedly on the side of the Axis powers. He fails at both for reasons that would take too long to get into, but neither Franco nor Vichy is willing to jump in as a full-fledged partner of the Axis forces. So he is frustrated in that. So again, he's casting about. He's trying to figure out what to do because the stubborn English won't quit. But he doesn't want to go to the level of invasion if he doesn't necessarily have to. Another complicating factor for Hitler is the intense inter-service rivalries that are going on at this particular time. So a few years before, 1938-39 timeframe, he created the OKW, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, a higher level, if you will, or the highest level of the Wehrmacht, a higher echelon to supposedly coordinate Wehrmacht planning and so on. But it didn't really function that way. It's really a tool of his control. Something that he could work through, particularly with Keitel and Jodl, to control the armed services. It wasn't really a joint planning staff like we would think of. OKW did very little planning. The services essentially are going in three different directions because obviously they're headed up by three extremely parochial, headstrong, and willful leaders. You have General Halder in the army. Of course, you have Goering as the leader of the Luftwaffe, and you have Admiral Raeder as the commander of the German Navy. And they are all going in three different directions because each of them thinks we're going to be the one to win the war for Hitler so that we get the glory and the credit for doing so. All right? So they're extremely loath to cooperate with each other. Okay? They're extremely interested in being parochial and guarding their own turf, and not. So this is obviously a problem. Now Hitler often encouraged them to fight amongst each other because it was an element of his control. That way, he could let them struggle against each other, but he was always in the position of the ultimate arbiter. to make the final decision, if you will. So he encouraged this in many cases as a political control tool. The problem is it was tremendously to the detriment of actual military or operational planning. Made it very inefficient and made it very quite poor, essentially, by later standards. So what were these views that the various services had disputes about? Right? When it came to an invasion, when this idea was broached or brought up, the Army was generally in favor of it. Halder was in favor of it, okay? Which makes sense because if you invade England, that is what? That is the strategy that puts the Army prominently up front. So obviously he would favor that. So in that, he wanted a broad front of the coast of England to invade, more than 225 miles of coastland from edge to edge, because he's looking at it from an Army point of view. He wants maximum maneuver space. Right? So he wants to be able to, and also to spread the English defense as far as he can before you penetrate off of the beaches and so on. Of course, the Navy is completely against this because the wider the invasion front is, the more naval forces it would take to do it. And he says, we don't have near enough shipping. We don't have near enough surface vessels to guard an invasion fleet of that size. There's no way it can be that wide. So they're already immediately at loggerheads. Right? So on that, they want a narrow invasion front, right? Only probably about 50 or 60 miles. Halder's against that because a narrow invasion front is easier to canalize and contain with defensive forces, and it's harder for them to spread out. So he thinks that's a recipe for suicide because either he'll be killed on the beach or he won't be able to have a breakout from the beachhead. So already the Army and Navy are fighting over this back and forth. Rader also says that because he is really pretty much against this idea in total. He doesn't want sea lion, what will become sea lion, to happen at all. He starts to insist on certain preconditions before the Navy will even consider it. And this is where they first broached the idea of air superiority. Right? He says that we have to have absolute air superiority over England, over the invasion area, before we'll even consider an invasion or escorting or the forces to take the Army to the beachheads. Right? This becomes, of course, a major sticking point in the entire operation planning. What does Goering and the Luftwaffe think? Well, like air forces very typically during that time, they want to win the war on their own. And the way to do that is strategic bombing. Right? So he doesn't want to share the glory of defeating England with anyone else, just like the other two don't. So he, of course, agitates for what would become the Battle of Britain. But at this early stage, of course, he's telling Hitler, the Luftwaffe can defeat England on its own. We can destroy it from the air. You don't have to worry about an invasion. You have nothing risky like that, so on and so forth. I can do the job all by myself. And this is attractive, of course, because, again, he doesn't have to risk an army. He doesn't have to do, all the risks of sending across the English Channel, a grinding land campaign in the English islands, all that kind of thing. That could potentially be avoided by simply destroying it from the air. Very antiseptic, if you will, very way to do that. So and he also says it could be done very quickly. He thinks in a couple of months we'll level England. Churchill will be crying to surrender, and then we can wrap this all up in just a few months. Everything else, he says, will take months and months and months, maybe years to do. We can avoid all that if you just let me do my thing and initiate a strategic bombing campaign. The last thing Goering wants to do is get tied down protecting an invasion fleet through the English Channel or, supporting something on the ground or on the ocean. He wants to do his own thing. As the discussions go on 30 June, there is a Führer conference. Hitler brings the various services together, the leaders, and all three of these gentlemen are there representing their services. And General Jodl from the OKW has a presentation on what are the strategic options against England. What can we do? So he calls it, his document is called The Continuation of the War Against England. And in it, he gives 6 separate strategic options to Hitler. Okay? First off, of course, continue diplomacy. Where we are, compromise, come up with some terms that the English will accept, so on, and maybe we can do it diplomatically. The second one, which obviously would be favored by the naval side of the house, is what they call the Handelskrieg, or the trade war. This has already been ongoing, but he would like it intensified. And we're talking about the U-boat campaign, a mining campaign in the ports, if you will, in the estuaries of England to sink ships, Luftwaffe involved in anti-shipping campaigns, things of this nature. They also, of course, have surface raiders to sink ships. They have the Hilfscruisers, the pocket ships to destroy commerce and shipping, essentially, to economically strangle England out of the war. Right? This is all almost completely navally based. So, of course, Raider thinks this is the way to go. That puts the Navy up front. But like all economic strategies, it takes time. It takes a long time to strangle an entire nation, if you will. This would be months, even years. So from that reason, it's not very decisive. It's not very conclusive. So that also does not appeal, if you will. But this is obviously the one that the Navy would favor. Of course, terror bombing would be the one that the Luftwaffe would favor. This is again Goering's idea of terrorizing, destroying English cities from the air, and forcing surrender in that particular way. Then, of course, there is the invasion that we already mentioned. Obviously, this is the one that's more favored by the Army because it puts the Army up front prominently. Right? Another idea that was mooted was to not worry about Britain in the homeland, but to use a peripheral strategy and attack England's substantial colonies and infrastructure and commonwealth that exist outside the islands. And in particular, of course, he's talking about the Mediterranean. Right? The Mediterranean areas, we're talking about Gibraltar, we're talking about Malta, of course, Egypt, and so on, and the oil fields of the Middle East that the English have. He says we should be down there attacking and strangle them that way, take away their oil fields, essentially eject the English from the Mediterranean theater entirely, of course, with the assistance of the Italians. So again, this is another one that the Navy would favor because it would put them prominently up front. And the final one, which of course is the one that Hitler is never going to take, is a defensive strategy. Stop where we are. Okay? We've won essentially all of Western Europe. Okay? Quit while we're ahead. Fortify. Just leave England alone because they can't do anything to us. We've already ejected them from the continent. We need to make fortress Europe because our real danger is what? The Russians. So we need to build our forces to defend against a possible Russian incursion in the future and essentially build up what we have and not worry about additional offensives, additional countries, go on the defensive for a while. Of course, to Hitler's mind, this is probably the least appealing of everything, because Hitler was many things, but defensive-minded, he definitely was not. He's always looking for new things to conquer. So it's an option, but probably the one that would have the least chance of Hitler actually selecting. In this conference, Hitler, again, with the idea of being the arbiter, and still is undecided, he decides that he wants many of these, if not all of these particular strategies pursued. So he tells the leaders of the Wehrmacht, the various services, to go ahead and do preliminary planning in all these different areas to see what they come up with. So the Army, and particularly the Navy, start looking at, when we talk about the invasion plans, down completely separate tracks without actually coordinating with each other on what each other's requirements are, each other's limitations, what their preferences are, what they're willing to do, what they're not willing to do, nothing. They're completely, planning is initiated in isolation. So the Army is looking at their ideas and the Navy is looking at their particular ideas. Right? So Hitler allows all of them to proceed, probably in the idea that when each of them gets to a certain point, he'll have enough information to make a decision at that particular point. When they recongregate or they reconstitute on 16 July in the conference, then Hitler issues Führer Directive number 16, the famous one where he directs that actual serious planning of what will become Sea Lion actually begins. So I have a couple of paragraphs there, not all of the directive, because some of it is not relevant to the discussion. But this just you look at that for a moment and to see what it says. The reason that I have highlighted the center paragraph there, or the center sentence, is for obvious reasons. This is where Hitler accepts the idea of requiring total air superiority. Right? So he has essentially bought the Navy's argument, or Rader's argument, that air superiority, if not what we would call almost air supremacy today, even though they didn't use that term then, would be a necessary precondition for the invasion to be initiated. So he's accepted the Navy's argument on that. But interestingly enough, later on, this shows that he's accepted what? The Army's argument about a wide front, the 225-mile wide front, not the narrow one that the Navy wants. So he's bought part of the Navy argument, and he's also accepted part of the Army argument, even though those two arguments actually contradict each other. So. And of course, he directs that within a month, everything should be planned and ready to go by the middle of August. And it was at that time that he personally gave it the name Seelöwe. Okay, it was the original planning. It was just called Operation Lion. That's the Wehrmacht name for it. But he tacked the C on the front of it. Why? We don't know. So I think the lion is pretty obvious. The English lion. The symbol. You can see the symbolism there. I guess because he go over the sea. I don't know. But anyway, he was the one that personally put Seelöwe as the name of it. Since air supremacy or superiority is so important here, I thought it would be worthwhile to answer the question, well, what does that mean? What do we mean by air supremacy or superiority? Okay. This is from the current Air Force doctrine. This is how the U.S. Air Force defines these terms. Okay. Air parity, you can see, neither side has control of the air, or it varies. It can vary from day to day or moment to moment. Okay, so essentially between equal forces. All right. Superiority, you can see, friendly operations are able to proceed without prohibitive interference. That doesn't mean there won't be any interference at all. It just means not enough to completely halt or stop our operation, to prohibit us from doing what we want to do on the ground or in the air or on the sea. Okay? Supremacy, of course, is better in that it means the enemy can still attack in the air, but it's completely ineffective. Essentially, they're shot down almost on the spot. But the other important thing, which really adds to our discussion, is you'll notice that superiority and supremacy does not have to be over the entire battlefront. It oftentimes it varies. It's temporary all the time. You can have temporary local air superiority if you flood an area for a particular point in time, but then it can do what? It can flow, it can ebb, it can go from one area to another area. It depends, of course, on many circumstances, how much air power you're willing to commit, on and on and on. So the point of this being is that the demand for total air superiority for the entire operation is pretty unrealistic and is pretty demanding. That's a very high bar. And it's thought that Rader demanded it because he thought that would kill the operation. I say he thought if I demand the moon, essentially, which I know cannot be done given the circumstances, then that way Hitler will call this whole thing off, based on that. But many historians, particularly the ones that I looked at, they argue that it was unrealistic and it was unnecessary. In the Battle of France, the German Luftwaffe did not have total air superiority at any time over France. The Luftwaffe battled both the English and the French Air Force for the entire period and lost a significant number of aircraft. They had temporary local superiority in various areas, but the Allied forces did too during certain battles. That did not prevent the Germans from winning the Battle of France. So some of the revisionist historical documents and research, they say that this demand for total air superiority really, it's a false flag. It wasn't really required. If they had been more serious about it, looking at more realistically and soberly at the conditions, the Luftwaffe was well capable of temporary local superiority for purposes of invasion. But this simply is a bar that's so high that the Navy knew it couldn't be met. So they thought that right there is a poison pill. Maybe with that we'll go ahead and kill it. So this is the Army's what they call the basis plan, or the wide front plan, that from end to end is more than 225 miles. Again, Halder wants to spread the forces so that he spreads the defense, and he also, of course, has the ability to conduct, what we would call blitzkrieg, encircling operations and things with armored spearheads and things of that particular nature. So all the way from here, all the way up essentially to Dover is where the landing beaches that he wants to use. Okay? He says that we need to land 10 divisions in the first 4 days, and he wants 3 divisions every 96 hours or so after that, until all the forces, more than 31 divisions, actually land in these particular waves. Again, this plan was done entirely in-house without any consultation with either the Luftwaffe or the Navy. You can imagine what the Navy said when they saw this. They were like, that's insane. There is no way in the world we can possibly have the shipping or the protection or coverage or escort or anything to enable an operation of this particular scale. So a negotiation period enters between the Army and the Navy in particular. Why isn't the Luftwaffe involved? Because Goering is busy doing what? He's planning the Battle of Britain. He doesn't want anything to do with this, and Hitler has pretty much agreed to let him try to defeat England in the air, which will turn into the Battle of Britain. So for all intents and purposes, the Luftwaffe is not really involved in these particular negotiations. And that's what it is. It's contentious negotiations between the German Army and the Navy on exactly what format or what form Sea Lion is going to take ultimately for the operation. Right? So again, you see the first one, the Navy says, okay, right here, this basis plan is a non-starter. Okay, forget it. We're not going to do that. Right? Raeder says we can't cover it. He doesn't want to risk any more of his capital ships in the English Channel. Raeder has just been through an experience when the Germans invaded Norway a few months before. And in that, the German surface Navy took a tremendous beating. Even though the invasion and occupation was a success, he lost 11 destroyers alone in that operation were sunk by the Royal Navy. Almost denuded him of a destroyer fleet. They had tremendous losses. This bears a lot on Raeder's mind. He has taken a hell of a shot, and he doesn't want to risk what he has left. He's very skittish now of tangling with the Royal Navy from a surface point of view. He doesn't want to do that. He wants to minimize his risk. Of course, we already talked about the superiority part. They even disagree on when the invasion is going to land, okay? Because the Army wants to hit the beach essentially at dawn, okay? Cross at night and land at dawn. OKM doesn't want to do that, right? Because the original dates that the Army had to do it, they said, we demand at least 50% moon illumination if we're going to travel at night across the English Channel for navigational purposes. Right? Well, there are only a few days every month that meet the conditions of at least 50% illumination in that particular area. And it was that more than anything else that pushed the possible dates, what would eventually become the last week of September, later than the 15th, but before the 30th of September, around 25 to 29 September became the dates. So, but a lot of people say, well, they were talking about the weather. You can't wait too late in the year because the English Channel gets too choppy, in the wintertime and all that kind of stuff. There's really more that the Navy's insistence on a certain level of illumination that pushed them to do that. They said, if you insist on us doing the crossing at night, you're going to have that level of illume, or we're not going to do it. Right. The Navy also comes up with this other plan that the Army thinks is absolutely ridiculous. They said what we need to do, again, because they're worried about Royal Navy, interdiction in this, we need an enormous diversionary operation to draw the Navy away from the landing area. So they called it Operation Herbstreise, which means autumn journey. Right. Launching from their new locations or their ports in Norway and also, again, around Denmark, they want to send the majority of their capital ships and fake, essentially, or feint an invasion of the northern coast around Scotland and East Anglia, which is this area right here. So they're hoping to draw the Royal Navy from its ports and bases up there to chase them away from the actual landing zone, which is here. All right. So the Army thinks this is crazy because they said, we need those capital ships to do what? What do you think? Protect our convoys that we're crossing. Why are you sending, the Admiral Hipper, the Seydlitz, some of these others, heavy cruisers, pocket battleships? Why are you up here trying to do a wild goose chase when we need them down here to guard the invasion fleet? Well, you know the reason why, because Raider doesn't want to do what? Get trapped in the English Channel, particularly in the Dover Straits, to tangle with the Royal Navy again. So again, here's another element of dispute between the two sides. Once Hitler gives the go-ahead, and he wants it by the middle of August, despite the disputes at the high levels between the Army and the Navy, it is a tremendous testament to the lower levels, if you will, of both the Army and Navy, that they essentially created a viable, workable invasion fleet from scratch. Because if we think back to 1940, the summer of 1940, what military had an amphibious invasion fleet of this capability? The answer is really only one had actually executed one before, and that was the Japanese. Right? Their special naval infantry had developed doctrine and the necessary amphibious ships, and they had conducted some amphibious operations on the coast of China. We think about, amphibious operations, that's the U.S. Marines. They pioneered all that. They had the doctrine. They had not actually done it by the summer of 1940. That would have to wait. Right? So we didn't have anything. Of course, the English didn't have anything. And the Germans had no tradition or history of doing amphibious operations, particularly on this particular scale. So all of this had to essentially be created from scratch in just a few months, from almost absolutely zero. It is incredible that they were able to do it with something that actually was viable and could have worked, feasible in the short time and with the resources that were actually available. Okay? They went and scoured Europe for every freighter, every tugboat, any fishing vessels, trawlers, catamarans, dinghies, anything they could find. They requisitioned everything from Germany, everything from every occupied country they could find. And it is just an absolute smorgasbord of shipping. It's unbelievable. It's something else. It's ships ranging from 300 to 10,000 tons in size to carry either personnel or cargo of one type or another. Okay? But of course, that wouldn't be enough. Most of the heavy equipment, logistics, and follow-on forces would be carried by barges. Okay, so most of these are river type or coastal type barges that have been reinforced for the English Channel crossing of one type or another. Okay, and most of these you can see that are modified. They had to create dropping bows and things like that. What will become the drop ramps and things that we're used to seeing in the Pacific later on. With the LSTs and so on that were developed, purpose built. They took these barges, civilian barges, and modified them on the spot and built ramps and barges and things directly on them. Again, a tremendous engineering effort from scratch. Amazing. So most of the initial assault forces would have to transfer from these vehicles, in particular the freighters and small boats of one type or another, into a Type 39 boat, okay, which looks like that. Okay, that's an actual one there. Outboard motor carries 7 to 10 troops, and you have an MG-34 there in the front for coverage. Right? So the initial assault forces would land on the beach in these. So here's another picture of a barge. You can see it's already been modified with a drop ramp on the front there. They assembled more than 2,300 of these in a month. That's pretty incredible right there. Okay. So in that, they had two types. They tried to standardize them, if you will. They have what they call the A1 and the A2. You can see the capacities there. The ones that were intended to carry tanks, either 3 or 4 tanks per barge, they had to be reinforced in order to take the weight. So they were reinforced on the inside with concrete, okay, on the inside. This actually made them pretty good operationally for this particular kind of operation, because not only could they bear the weight of the tanks, but also the concrete was a form of armor, if you will, to protect against small arms or low caliber fire of one type or another. And the barges are extremely shallow draft. They're almost flat in the water, if you will, which is an important passive defense against possible torpedo attacks. Almost every torpedo is going to run far too deep if it's not completely on the surface to sink any barges again. So this actually worked out pretty well. Now, some of these were powered on their own. They had engines. Most of them are unpowered. They're made to be towed barges. So even the ones that were powered, their engines were too weak to cross the channel. They were made for inland rivers mostly. But they had a plan for both of those to be pulled by tugboats, of which they had several hundred. And generally, the idea was 2 barges per tugboat to carry them across at about 6 to 8 knots, depending. Additional weapons. And again, here's where the German innovation is quite amazing. And some of these ideas, you'll see some of this later on in the Normandy invasion, because we adopted some of these ideas as well. Okay? So we have the undersea Panzer. So instead of the U-boat, we have the U-tank. Right? So we have it here, a Mark III sealed up, if you will, with a snorkel on the end. And you drop it over the side, and the idea was it would land on the seabed, essentially, and the crew would do what? Drive it underwater right up onto the beach, using the snorkel, obviously, for air. It doesn't show it here, but the other end of the snorkel has a float on it, if you will, with the opposite end. So this float is basically trailing behind on the surface of the tank as it drives up right onto the shore. Now, this sounds like crazy, doesn't it? But they did a number of experiments, and it actually was feasible. It did work. Okay. Now, of course, you're not going to pay me to get in that thing because, number one, you couldn't go more than 50 feet, So otherwise, your snorkel was in the water and you would drown. Also, they said an hour, probably within 30 to 35 minutes, carbon monoxide is going to begin to become a problem for the crew. So you definitely, the clock's ticking the moment you get in the water, and you better be out of it probably within 30 to 40 minutes, or you're going to have a problem. Okay? So the biggest issue, obviously, would be what does the surface that they're driving on look like? Because if you run into a ditch or a rock or some kind of debris under there and get stuck, you're done. Okay? So, and the other problem is navigation. You can't see out of that thing. So they were taught, or the crews were trained, basically with their internal inertial compass, take a heading, and hopefully, in a short period of time, you'll come out of the water. So it was obviously paramount that you did what? You better be going in the right direction, okay, or you're going to be in trouble. Okay, so they did a number of experiments with this in various areas of Germany and water on various islands, and they proved the concept would work. But they did have some testing casualties. They had a couple of instances where the crew was incapacitated by carbon monoxide leakage of one type or another. And they had some that got stuck on unexpected obstacles under the water, and the tank was trapped. And most of those cases, they had rescue crews right there. They could go and rescue the crew. If this had been done in actual combat, there wouldn't have been any rescue crew. I mean, they're on their own. Right? The other idea is the S-Panzer, or the Schwimmpanzer, right? Which is, of course, a tank with floats to drive on the surface with a propeller in the back. So they modified a number of Panzer IIs, the original, the light Panzer with the 20 millimeter cannons up front, and some Panzer IVs were modified this way. You can see the numbers there. Of course, this is better because you're on the surface. You like that. But the other problem is these are obviously very susceptible to enemy fire. And if you sink one pontoon and not the other, what's that tank going to do? It's going to turtle almost immediately. So that also would have been basically a risk there of one. But again, the concepts were proven, and again, only in a few weeks they came up with these innovative ideas, which is quite amazing. You probably in Normandy, when we talk about D-Day, we used not this, but this concept with the Sherman DD tanks. You know, the ones instead of these are rigid pontoons, but we had those inflatable. Basically bellows, that went around the tank and so on. But this is where the idea comes from. So very interesting. But of course, the idea is to do what? Get armor support on the beach to help the infantry as quickly as possible. Not to wait, but to get immediate fire support and armor support in the most rapid way to support the infantry on the beach. Here's another idea, amazing ingenuity. And the story is quite interesting. There's a man named Franz Siebel. He is a Luftwaffe major. And at this particular moment in time, when the preparations are taking place, he is in France. He has been tasked by the Luftwaffe to reconstitute a French aircraft factory and reorient it to build German planes. That's his job. So while he is there, he is approached by some other officers that are working on building the fleet for Sea Lion, and they ask him for supplies. They need they need pontoons. Do you have this other stuff that have to do with concrete for reinforcing the barges, whatever the case may be. So they're just asking him for supplies. He says, and Siebel says, "What do you need them for?" So they explain, well, we're building this invasion fleet, yada, 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 so on and so forth about Sea Lion. Siebel becomes very intrigued. And when he figures out exactly what they're planning to do for this improvised fleet, he goes, I can do better than that. Well, as it turns out, even though Siebel is a major, pretty far down on the pecking order, he is personal friends with Goering and several others in the hierarchy of the Luftwaffe. So he gets permission, essentially, or authorization to drop what he's doing with the French aircraft factory and work full time on developing amphibious craft of one type or another for Sea Lion. And his idea he comes up with is called the Siebel Ferry. So in here you can see it's a catamaran design, two hulls with the common deck across the front of them there. But he is concerned about the slow speed of the barges and the tugboats that are going to go across the English Channel, and only, they're only going to cross maybe 3, 4, 5 knots, depending on conditions. So he develops this as a stable platform, and his idea is to either use 4 automobile or truck engines mounted in series, or 3 aircraft engines. So it's something of a ersatz airboat, if you will, if you could think about it. But he has his hands on many obsolete aircraft engines. Most of these are old BMW engines from early 30s designs, and most of them are water cooled, which obviously for aircraft use is not optimal. They had been abandoned long ago. But he has many of these engines just rotting away in warehouses. He says the water cooled is no detriment to this, like it would be in an aircraft. So he puts 3 of those, builds mounts, and essentially uses aircraft engines to motivate these Siebel ferries. And again, he can get up to 10 or 12 knots with these fully loaded, much faster than the original design had been. Okay? You can see here again, each one could carry 100 tons. Okay? And because of its design, it doesn't need a bow ramp. It can essentially go straight up, almost completely straight up on the beach and offload directly. So absolutely innovative design. Right? Interestingly enough, as he built more and more of these, I think they ended up with about 50 or 55 were complete before the date of Sea Lion would have taken place. Rather than use initially for cargo or supplies or things of that nature, the idea was to use them as gun platforms. As you can see in the upper one there, this one in particular has 4 88 millimeter cannon, and you can see up here in this area, I don't know if you can see it right there, you have flak batteries, 20 millimeter cannon on the upper decks there. So obviously for anti-aircraft defense of the flotilla as it crossed, number one. When it got range of the shore, then it would operate as naval gunfire, could fire directly on the shore. And once it hit the beach, it was intended that these guns be offloaded onto the shore for the infantry. Then the stripped Siebel ferry would go back for the next load, back and forth. So very, very innovative, very interesting design there. That's just another picture of one that shows the aircraft engines a little bit better. The interesting thing about these is apparently the engines were completely unmuffled. They just had an exhaust stack. They must have been the noise must have been insane. All three of those engines running next to you with no muffling whatsoever. I don't even know how you could stand it. Absolutely. But they moved them. I mean, they motivated them, which is what they were looking for. For escort from the Navy and, of course, from the Luftwaffe, during this time, while the planning is going on, the Navy and the Luftwaffe actually had not entirely been idle. And in particular, I wanted to highlight the 10th Flieger Corps. Okay? There was a constant turf battle between Raeder and Goering because Raeder wanted Luftwaffe assets to fight the Handelskrieg, the trade war, the blockade war. And of course, Goering didn't want to give them up. He doesn't want to give up control of anything. But after a bureaucratic squabble, Raeder manages to convince Hitler to order Goering to release some assets for essentially an anti-shipping campaign from the air against England. And this is conducted mostly during July and August prior to the Battle of Britain. But they create the Luftwaffe, a specialized Luftwaffe unit called the 10th Flieger Corps, which has 3 or 4 anti-shipping squadrons using these particular aircraft. All right. The Ju-88 dive bomber has just become operational and is beginning to appear in large numbers in the Luftwaffe. And it is an excellent dive bomber against ships, as it turns out. Right? The Heinkel 115 proves to be it's a seaplane, but it proves to be an excellent platform for launching torpedoes. Right? And of course, the Focke-Wulf Condor, which you're probably familiar with, not only long-range reconnaissance, surveillance. It started out life for the Lufthansa as an airliner before the war began. It also proves to be an excellent weapon in anti-shipping, both torpedo and bomber. Right? With this particular Flieger Corps initiates an anti-shipping campaign that, given the relative size of the unit, really achieves results all out of proportion to the actual Flieger Corps itself. They damage and sink a tremendous amount of English shipping, both freighters, normal commerce shipping of one type or another, but also a number of Royal Navy surface ships, in particular destroyers. And the point of all that being is that this is going to have a bearing on the Royal Navy's attitude about Operation Sea Lion. This becomes a real menace to both English commercial and the Royal Navy shipping and ships that are operating in the English Channel. So let's turn and look at the English real quick here. What do they have to defend against Sea Lion? Right? Well, of course, we will start out with the RAF. Right? So it's important to remember that by the time Sea Lion becomes really serious, the last part of August, you're going into the first part of September, what would be called the Battle of Britain has already been going on for a period of time. Okay? Attritional warfare, if you will, between the Luftwaffe and the RAF. Right? But for actually opposing directly an invasion of Sea Lion, these are really the two areas that the RAF can bring to bear on it. Right? In the summer of 1940, bombers like the Wellington and the Lancaster are still in the future. So really the ferry battle of the Blenheim bomber are the only two bombers that are immediately to hand that they can use. They are light bombers. You can see their bomb load is quite modest, if you will. And they don't have anything like the Flieger Corps as far as anti-shipping capability goes. So a very modest bombing capability. Of course, they still have numerous fighters. Of course, we have the Spitfire and the Hurricane. Approximately 600 aircraft in September were operational at that particular time. But again, they don't really have any bombing capability whatsoever. So you're talking a strafing capability. It would be a nuisance, but it would not stop an invasion on its own. When we get past the Air Force, of course, then we have to go to the Royal Navy. Right? What does the Royal Navy have to oppose sea lion? Well, most conventional histories talk about, well, sea lion never had a chance because the Navy would have just crushed them in the English Channel. You know, they had overwhelming numbers. They would have just wiped them out if they'd ever attempted to do it. Well, maybe, maybe not. It depends. Of course, ship for ship, they greatly outnumber what's left of the German surface fleet. However, they also have worldwide responsibilities. The majority of those ships are where? They're in some other part of the world, defending the English, the English Empire somewhere else in this particular area. We're going to look here. These are the ships that are actually available at this particular time in the home waters that potentially could oppose the invasion fleet. Okay? So you can see it's a number of ships, but that is a much less than half of the actual Royal Navy in and of itself. The majority of the Royal Navy is somewhere else at this particular time. The two main ports, Scapa Flow and Rosyth here, where the majority of the ships are based, particularly the heavy capital ships, the heavy cruisers and battleships. This is their sailing time from those ports down to the actual area where the invasion would have taken place. As you can see, it's a number of hours. It would take a while for ships to get there from the moment of alert down to the actual where they could actually oppose or interdict the invasion. In 20 to 28 hours, the first wave certainly, and maybe part of the second wave, would have already been on shore by that time. Okay, so they would be coming. In the immediate area of Sea Lion, these are the ships that could have possibly intercepted or been involved in trying to interdict the very first wave. Once they realized this was the actual invasion. These are the forces that could be immediately brought to bear. As you can see there, I'm going to see where they are in just a moment. These are the ships and their actual locations at the time of Sea Lion. Right? So if the invasion area is here, really, these are the two areas that the Germans had to worry about more than anything else. Most of the others, you can see Rosyth is here next to Edinburgh, and of course Scapa Flow is way up there at the top, by the Orkney Islands there. Okay? The invasion would be coming over obviously at night. Right? And this is a time where the Royal Navy ships, and almost all ships of all belligerents, they do not yet have radar. So they would have to fight at night visually. Okay? That was an art that the Royal Navy was not very good at, to put it mildly. Really, hardly anyone was, except maybe the Japanese. The Japanese Navy made a fetish of training for night surface actions, which we would find out to our detriment during Guadalcanal campaign. But almost no other Navy gave a lot of attention to night fighting. Right? And without radar at night, and you would imagine that the Germans would be using obscurants and smoke and all kinds of things of that nature, it is very problematic whether a night surface action could have actually stopped Sea Lion, even if they had been at the location. Of course, the problem with them fighting during the day is, again, the 10th Flieger Corps. Okay, that would put them, particularly in this narrow channel here, they would be lined up as targets essentially for the anti-shipping operations or attacks of the Luftwaffe. So that would be a definite risk. All right. So of these resources, you can see here the most of the estimates of historians is they had the resources to possibly essentially tangle with 2 of the 4 planned beaches or invasion routes of the corps that the Germans had. And we'll look at B and D in just a moment. They were the most vulnerable to basically the proximity of the Royal Navy forces. Now, that only means they have the resources. And that doesn't presuppose that the Royal Navy can both see the invasion in time, alert the forces, and coordinate the attack. This just means they have the raw resources to do it. Whether they could have actually coordinated them and had a coordinated attack is, of course, a whole nother question. If the Navy can interdict and the Air Force can interdict, of course, that leaves what? The final, if you will, the final defense is, of course, what? The English land forces, the British Army. Right? These are the forces that were actually on the island, if you will, potentially could have been employed against a German invasion. So you see 27 infantry and 2 armored divisions but most of them were either half strength or less, or they're either partially trained or untrained. Okay? The majority of the forces had been what? There were the losses in the BEF. Okay? So they had numbers, but they had lost the majority of their experienced long service, officers, NCOs, and so on. Most of these are raw troops, right? And so on. They would have to be trained. Certainly, from an operational or tactical point of view, they are not anywhere close to the equal of the German army at this particular time. Because who's coming over for the German army are battle-hardened veterans of the Polish campaign and the French campaign. Okay, so there would be a huge disparity in operational virtuosity, if you will. But of combat soldiers, probably about 100,000 right now in raw numbers are available in the British Islands to oppose an invasion of one type or another. We already mentioned they lost a tremendous number of tanks in France, had to leave them behind or they were destroyed in the Battle of France. This is the estimated number of actual armor that is located right now, if you will, in England to oppose Sea Lion. Right? And again, this is early days in the war, so most of the more capable tanks haven't been built yet. Right? So their number one tank, of course, is the Matilda or the Matilda II, what they called an infantry tank. Extremely heavily armored, very slow, and very undergunned. Okay, with a 2-pounder gun, most of them. Okay, so tough to kill, but doesn't have a whole lot of punch to it. Okay, the majority of their tanks, though, are the older cruiser tanks from the 30s, and of course the old immediate post-World War I light tanks of one type or another. And most of these either have 2-pounders or machine guns alone. Okay, so the armor's not looking so good. It's estimated that of the 100,000, it might be possible within a week of a landing to bring 35 to 45,000 British troops to bear, essentially on a beachhead or wherever the incursion might happen to be. Right? In terms of the Home Guard, I always hear about the Home Guard, so on. So, of course, the Home Guard, a citizen militia, essentially, is what it was. They had no problem forming the units. Of course, these are not trained soldiers. Most of them, of course, are, they're not in the military for one reason or another. They're over age, so on and so forth. So we can't think of them as soldier for soldier, the equivalent of a British Army soldier, or of course, of a German soldier. They do have numbers, however. In the landing area and immediately beyond the landing area, there are approximately 80,000 on the rolls, if you will, that are signed up for the Home Guard. They have plentiful small arms, bolt-action rifles, and there is plentiful small arms ammunition, but in everything else, they are deficient. Okay? They have no artillery of any sort. They have no armor support of any kind. They have some Bren light machine guns, typically, 1 or 2 per company, and that's pretty much it. So numbers, yes. Operational capability, that's a little bit more open to question. This is the disposition at the time of the planning of Sea Lion of the units of the British Army across the British Isles. Right. So recently, General Alan Brooke, who is going to soon become famous for being the right-hand man of Churchill throughout the war, as the leader of the British General Staff. At this time, he is the commanding general of the Home Command. Okay? So he's in charge of the defense of Britain. He has withdrawn some units to create a general headquarters reserve, and you can see the numbers up there, of which the majority of his available armor units is in the reserve to be held centrally so that he can use it to rush to one area or another, if you will. Okay? Having given that, they have essentially what they call a crust defense, a forward defense, but once you're beyond that, there's really nothing behind it, if you will, to defend against an invasion, except for the GHQ reserve. Right? In this particular area where the landing is going to take place, you can see the actual units that are stationed there. We have 2 Territorial Army infantry divisions, you can see there, a regular Army infantry brigade in this location, and a motor machine gun brigade. But in this particular area of Southern Command or Eastern Command here, where the invasion is going to take place, there is a troop to space problem, as you can see. 2 companies are expected to cover almost 2 miles of beach. Right? So you can imagine how spread out that is. Right? In this particular area where 2 companies are, and we'll look at it in a moment, according to the Sea Lion plan, those two companies would be hit by a German regiment. Okay? So they're probably not going to be there very long, generally speaking. So they are extremely spread out, and they do not have any kind of defense in depth. They're limited on mines. They essentially have no anti-personnel mines at this particular time. They have anti-tank mines, but that's not going to do much against infantry because it takes several hundred pounds of pressure to detonate a anti-tank mine. Right? They have some coastal defense batteries, a certain number of those. They have begun to try to create some beach obstacles of one type or another, but very rudimentary, extremely rudimentary. Now, given time into 1941, they will become quite formidable. But at this particular point in time, they had just barely begun to create beach defenses, and they are not very strong or very significant at this particular time. That is the area in yellow. Okay, we've zoomed in here on the unit dispositions at this particular spot with the planned 4 German invasion beaches indicated there. Okay, so you can see here's the 45th Division in this area. The 1st London Division is in this area, and over here you have the 29th Infantry Brigade. Okay, so but in all of these, the British defense is severely outnumbered in all locations. With the German invasion on the beaches. Additionally, as we'll see in a moment, Sea Lion incorporates a airborne drop, which is going to occur here near this town of Postling, right here. Okay, and we'll look at that in just a moment. So there's going to be additional, a German airborne division is going to land as part of the plan. After the negotiation between the Army and the Navy, remember I said first the Army came up with this wide plan. The Navy said, no way in heck. You know, they're fighting it out, going back and forth. This was something of the compromise plan that was eventually agreed upon toward the end of August into the 1st of September. I have final in quotes because, again, this was still in flux to a certain degree. They were still ironing out details. They were still arguing over different things of one type or another. But essentially, this was the compromise that they came up with. You'll notice how much it is narrowed. So this, the area over here where we had originally Landing Beach H is gone. Okay, Landing Beach A, which was over by Ramsgate, has disappeared. So we've gone from 6 to 4 invasion beaches there in the center. Now the front is about 65 miles end to end instead of 225 miles end to end. And again, we still have 3 waves. You can see the units identified that we're going to land. Okay? It is almost exclusively infantry up front and assault troops and pioneer troops. The idea being to immediately land, defeat the forces of the English on the beach, gain a immediate foothold, a beachhead, if you will. The second wave being extremely armor heavy. And this is where they bring in the tanks of one type or another to provide support once you have enough room on the beachhead. The third wave, support wave, would be mostly infantry, but a mixture of both panzer and infantry forces of one type or another. So what would the landing look like, at least if the Germans had been able to do it the way they wanted to? This is just a notional timeline that could have been followed. Again, at 0600 or basically at dawn, the break of dawn is when the Army wanted to hit the beach, essentially, just as dawn is breaking. The assault forces would hit the beach at the same time as the first drops of the 7th Airborne Division behind the lines are taking place, almost simultaneously. Okay. The airborne objective, once they're on the ground and clear their particular area of their PZs, is to assist, and we'll see this in a moment, on the eastern side. Let's see, I can jump back here. They're going to drop right around there where it says M20, where the B is, and to assist in the capture of both Folkestone and Dover, because those are the 2 primary ports in this area. The Germans want those ports as fast as they can to accept shipping for additional reinforcement. So both the ground forces at B and also the airborne forces are going to be energetically working for the most rapid capture of both Folkestone and Dover harbors. It's expected to clear the beaches and gain a lodgment that can be defended would take 2 to 3, maybe 4 hours, okay, for the second wave to come in. Okay. In the afternoon, the barges would be discharging the second wave. This is the point where the German invasion fleet would be the most vulnerable to air attack. The RAF has no night capability, but now if it's broad daylight, you have shipping up on the beach, it's not maneuvering. Essentially have, the targets are right there. So the defense of that, of course, this is where the Luftwaffe comes in with temporary or localized air superiority. So in this case, this is probably where you would see the majority of the air battles over the landing zones take place between the RAF and the Luftwaffe. And of course, we already saw the Siebel ferries, with their flak batteries and guns would obviously be operating as well. But this is probably this is where it would be maximum danger for the invasion fleet from air defense or air attack from the British. Right. You can see the objectives here. By the end of the first day, they would hope to get almost 40,000 troops on shore by the end of the first day. That sounds like a lot, but that's actually fewer troops than were landed at Normandy on the first day by quite a bit. We had over 90,000 troops on the beach on the first day of Normandy. So this is within the realm of possibility. It is feasible. Right? The beachheads, of course, from being four separate beachheads, they would want to do what? Merge them as soon as possible to create one common beachhead. They would like to do that by S-Tag, which is D-Day. That's how the Germans would say it. S+4. They would want the beachhead linked into one common beachhead. Okay. S+9, the second wave would be complete with the armor, the Panzer divisions onshore, and 25 divisions by S+16 so that they can, no later than the 17th day, initiate the advance out of the beachhead toward what they call the first operational objective, which we'll see in a moment. Yes, sir.
How long would it take the reserve force to reach the beachhead if they're expecting 9 days to get all the armor?
Sure. The transit time is approximately, obviously with no interruptions, 6 to 8 hours across the channel, essentially. So you could say a majority of either a day or a night to cross the channel, and then they have to be offloaded. The idea, of course, that this is, of course, we're talking optimums. This is if everything goes well. Then if they have the Folkestone and the Dover harbors by then, this obviously would simplify things tremendously for the Germans. Please.
The general that part
Alan Brooke. Yes, Brooke.
Where was his reserve located physically from up the north part of the country?
Central located.
About how far would that take to bring that? They would be there.
Well, obviously there's some speculation. Obviously, there would be some delay in, I guess you would say, realizing that this was an actual invasion, because we have the feints, we have and of course, the best way to look at it is try to put it in context of the reverse for Normandy. Okay, in that case, the Germans were defending, wondering where we were going to land, and we were doing the deception. And of course, you were familiar with all the different deception campaigns and so on. So in this case, the boot's on the other foot. Now the Germans are trying to deceive, and we're, the Allies essentially are on the defensive side of the picture. So the English have to realize that it is an actual invasion. This is the real thing. It's not another feint. Okay. Then they have to get an idea of the magnitude of the invasion, of course. And then it's a matter of at what point Brooke wants to commit his reserve, because once he does that, that's all he has. That's it. If he commits it in the wrong place at the wrong time, he has no other play. So all of that would probably lead him to be cautious, I would say. So I would say probably several days, maybe up to a week, before you would probably see the majority of that reserve committed against the beachheads. That's just total guess on my part, but based on my study and reading. Okay. Again, I would think in this particular case, Brooke was also known as he certainly was not a reckless or aggressive individual. He was very careful, very much like Montgomery. Montgomery wants set piece, lots of planning. He doesn't want to leave a lot of things to chance. Brooke was cut from the same mold. So I would think, given the stakes here, invasion of the homeland, he would have been extremely careful and cautious about committing that reserve. But once he did, probably within 5 to 7 days would be my best guess. But does that help?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Oh, great. Okay, good. Yes, please.
You mentioned the British Army.
I'm sorry?
You mentioned the operational capability of the Humgarn in terms of assets that they had available.
Yes.
I've looked there a little bit, and I saw things about like the bombard, the protector, a lot of these home guard weaponry.
Mhm. Yes.
Was that in any ordinary number for them to call upon? Was that spread out and really not larger scale properties?
Based on my study, again, the one thing the Home Guard had an abundance of was small arms. They had no issue with small arms. Everything above small arms level was in extremely short supply of one type or another. They probably were not going to ever see any honest artillery, except for what you're talking about, projectors and things that are essentially they're home built, if you will. They may have been able to get some, beaverettes or armored car support of one type or another, but they would have not gotten regular Army artillery or armor support probably of any type. So I would say again, it's some speculation. The operational capability of the Home Guard against an honest German invasion, their operational capability would have been low, quite low. Now, that's not to say that given a little bit more into the timeline, they could not have become something of a guerrilla force, if you will, a guerrilla type campaign as part of fighting against something like occupational forces, which we're familiar with, like in Yugoslavia. The Tito in Yugoslavia had a tremendous partisan, to use the Russian word, partisan campaign against the German occupiers. Could the English have done the same? Obviously, we don't know, but the Home Guard, I would think, would be the nucleus of that particular effort if it had occurred. Right. So here is a notional, if you will, German landing formation on the beach, just to give you an idea of the mix of the various vessels and who would be involved. Of course, you're preceded by minesweepers, of course, to clear out any possible mines that are in the water. We have minesweepers and patrol boats. Again, the troops, the assault boats, and the dinghies like the one we saw, the Type 39, the troops will be offloaded. They would go to the beach, again, to try to clear out that particular area. Then auxiliary gunboats, and in particular here you would probably see the Siebel ferries, again, to provide, besides just anti-aircraft defense, they would essentially naval gunfire for these advanced forces. And hopefully, if everything goes well, of course, they would be able to deliver those guns directly onto the beach to become, land guns. Then the ferry can go back for more, essentially, and come back. So here, of course, with the follow-on forces, once the assault forces are in, you have the tugs and the tugs towing typically 2 barges each. In this, they show a powered and an unpowered each. It would depend, obviously, but you would have the powered in the back so that it could help essentially to the maximum extent it could to move the forces in the main body. Here's a diagram of the plan for the airborne drop, if you will, around the town of Postland here. Okay? So available to the Luftwaffe at that time, a maximum of 12 battalions of Fallschirmjäger. Okay? So 9 are contained within the division itself. They had access to 3 additional battalions if they called upon it. Okay? Ju-52s, of course, are the primary drop aircraft for the airborne. Ju-52s had taken significant losses during the Battle of France. They were a little bit in short supply. At the time of Sea Lion, you can see they had approximately 200 operational at that time. Of those 200, they could take 5 battalions in a single lift. So that means what? To drop the entire division of the 12 battalions, they have to make at least 1 round trip, maybe 2. So 3 sorties. Okay? The first drop, they're going over essentially pre-dawn. They would fly in extremely low under chain home radar. They probably would have, the initial one, they would have probably been completely undetected. First 5 battalions are in. By the time they returned, it would be a totally different story. Because obviously now it's daylight, the RAF is alerted, you have the battle over the channel. That would have been much more problematic. But the first wave, if you will, or the first drop, probably would have gone quite well. It would have been essentially unopposed. So you can see here the 2 different Kampfgruppe here and Fallschirm regiments here. And of course, the idea once getting this particular area, this is landing area B. So the B Corps, if you will, is landing here. They're dropping immediately behind to help secure it. This is also the easternmost landing beach. and Folkestone and Dover are immediately to the east. So they would be used again to try to capture those cities or those towns and those harbors as fast as possible for follow-on resources. So here again, we have the coast. We have our 4 corps. You can see the units that were assigned to the 4 corps. So initially, of course, we have the 4 landing areas, and you can see the airborne drop up in the corner there, close to Folkestone. Remember, by S+4, these would be separate beachheads. Then they hopefully would be merged and united in one beachhead that could be defensible. So from this point on, the British cannot throw them into the sea, so to speak. They're there to stay. Now, whether they can go any further is another question. This of course. But as I mentioned before, after consolidation and landing, this is the line of what the plan called for the first operational objective, not later than S+17. Right, at this line here. And they indicated a second operational objective would be at this line here. The plan itself does not give a particular timeline for the accomplishment of the second operational objective. It's left somewhat hanging, if you will. Right. So again, this reflects something of we're going to land and we're going to see what develops. Sort of picture there, which again in the German planning process, all during the war, we see some vagueness, if you will. If you recall the Operation Barbarossa, we have 3 enormous army groups, north, central, and south. Beyond the invasion and of course, the encirclement of the Red Army and these Kesselschlatz, essentially these cauldron battles, the actual objectives changed. And you're probably familiar with Hitler arguing with his generals about should we go to Moscow? Is that should we capture the capital? Should we go to the north? Originally, it was to go to the north. They wanted to go to Leningrad. Then it changed to Moscow. And of course, after the defeat of Moscow, and I was here to brief the Stalingrad piece, that whole campaign, Operation Blau, is when Hitler decided to do what? Go to the south, to the Caucasus. So again, the German high planning has a habit of shifting focuses or foci all the time. So there is some vagueness once you get past the first operational objective. It's sort of, well, we'll get here, and then it's whatever Hitler wants to do, essentially, after that point. I'm sure they would figure if they actually reached this line, hopefully the English would be what? Willing to negotiate at this point and come to a political settlement of one type or another at that particular point.
In Operation Overlord, we're planning for Normandy. There was a extreme importance on the capture of
Kind.
Harbor City. With the current beachhead at once they leave it, are they okay for resupply on their echelons? They have that Dover to the east over there. Is there a importance for them to capture that? That's an operation continues. Or does the initial landing support there?
Well, that is a good question. There's obviously some speculation about that. I think if they had reached the first operational objective, they were there. I mean, they could not have been essentially militarily thrown off the island, so to speak. But that doesn't mean that interdiction by the British obviously would be continuing. Plus, obviously, the counterattacks and the General Reserve. You could have ended up. We'll talk about this at the end. A stalemate, essentially, from a military point of view. They can't go any further in, but we can't kick them out either. So we're sort of at loggerheads here, which probably, again, that would have been germinated the idea of a political settlement at that point, because neither side can win militarily. So, of interest, you probably heard of this. It's kind of fascinating, so I threw this in here. The Gestapo, of course, had their plans once, of course, Germany invaded, conquered England, and had occupying forces or an occupation force to basically rule England, as a Nazi province or whatever. There have been endless spy books and novels and things written on this particular premise of one type or another. But of course, the Germans always plan ahead, and the Heydrich, the SD commander for the Gestapo, had already indicated this SS Brigade Führer Franz Six was going to be the Gestapo commander in Great Britain. He would be the head man in Great Britain for the Gestapo, and he was given this list called the Special Search List Great Britain of 2,800 prominent English men and women that were to be arrested on sight. They were to be basically hunted down, captured, and imprisoned, arrested for interrogation and possible deportation. And I didn't have obviously time to print all 2,800, but of course people like Churchill are on there, the English government, novelists like Noel Coward are on there. Anyone who is, it's a who's who of English society of one type or other. Sigmund Freud was on the list, even though 3 years before he'd already immigrated to the United States. So their intel wasn't quite up to snuff on some of these. Some of the people that are on the list died years before, and they didn't know about it. But they supposedly printed hundreds of these books for Gestapo agents to fan out across the country and seize all these different prominent what they consider anti-Nazi English folks of one type or another, due to bombing. The bombing obviously later on in the war, where a lot of these, supposedly only 3 paper copies of this actually exist today of the hundreds that were originally printed. One of which is on display in the Imperial War Museum. So so I'm not sure where the other 2 copies are. So again, just sort of an interesting vignette of obviously of something that never happened because they never got that far. But they had plans, to take care and arrest a bunch of people they thought would be troublemakers, ringleaders for any future resistance to their occupation. Please.
Did he book wise plan for the Royals?
Oh, yes. Was there a plan for the Royals? Very, very interesting question. Obviously, the current royal family would have been on that list, okay, as anti-Nazis. But you bring up the point of who was essentially abdicated in 1936, Edward, if you will. Of course, he had the throne, and then he abdicated because of why? He gave up the throne for Wallace Simpson, the American divorcee that he ended up marrying. Okay. Both he and his wife, Edward, had pro-Nazi sympathies. They had gone during the late 30s. They had gone to visit Hitler. They had attended Nazi events and rallies. They spoke well, of Hitler and the Nazi Party. To be fair to them, they weren't certainly not the only English folks that supported, if you will, or sympathetic to Nazism in the late 30s. There were quite a few, but they certainly were probably the most prominent that did. Now, what did Churchill do with Edward and his wife? Well, they were named the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, and he shipped them off to the Bahamas. He became the governor of the Bahamas. So he said, I want them not only out of here, I want them out of the hemisphere. So he sent them all the way to the Western Hemisphere to get them out of the way. The speculation is had this worked, that Hitler would have brought them back and put them on the throne of England as a Nazi sympathetic royal family. That was supposedly the plan. So obviously something else that didn't happen.
That raises an interesting question. Some war games and other things I've seen mention politically that there's a black shirts faction within England.
Yes.
Some of them posit that they could have formed a militia that militarily could have been something. Would that be so minute that it really wouldn't play much into a wider front?
Good question. Was there an English equivalent of the brown shirts, essentially, or they could have formed basically a brown shirt or SA, something like that. There was a British Union of Fascists. The British Fascist Party was headed by a man named Oswald Mosley, okay, or Sir Oswald Mosley, actually, and the actual numbers of the BUF were relatively small in the 30s, probably maybe 8 to 10,000 totally. But they made a lot of noise, far greater than their actual numbers. They attracted a lot of attention, if you will. They had rallies. They were extremely, obviously, vocal supporters of Hitler. They were very much supporters of appeasement, and they certainly wanted the British to give in to Hitler's demands. Fellow travelers, if you will, in that respect. When Churchill becomes prime minister, he has those individuals immediately interned. He put Mosley in prison for the rest of the war. Essentially, he spent the war in a jail cell. And the British Union of Fascists, once the war was declared, essentially vanished as a political force, never to be heard from again. So I would think it is entirely reasonable that had the Sea Lion operated or had worked, that they would have obviously Mosley would have been sprung, and he probably would have occupied a Quisling position, of some type in a puppet government along with his followers. But the numbers themselves, whereas the SA in Germany had millions of members, they're a very significant force, if you will. The actual number of card-carrying fascists in England was probably never more than 10,000 at any particular point. So pretty small. But of course, having said that, a lot of people tend to do what? It's human nature to go with the winner. And if Churchill loses and Hitler wins, then a lot of people do what? They go along to get along. So those numbers could have swelled, and a lot of people probably would have joined whatever the version of the British Nazi Party would have been. Almost a man in the high castle vibe to that in a way.
As Todd, we probably would not have been threatened by internal saboteurs. That's probably more likely due to the dispersion of numbers. Like you say, 10,000. 10,000 across England is not actually much.
No, it's not. Yeah, no. As far as I know, they confine their activities completely to the political realm. They did not conduct any kind of a sabotage or a terrorist campaign, I guess you might say, of any like that. Once Mosley was imprisoned and the war broke out, essentially they vanished like I said, never to be heard of again. But of course, this is the question. Could it have worked? Well, we don't know. Obviously, again, that's why at the top of the program I talked about the speculation. If something is tried, it either works or it doesn't, and you can discuss or analyze that. It's a lot harder to analyze something that never took place. You can only look at the plans, and like we have looked at the relative, what the Russians would call the correlation of forces, the balance of power, and make some educated guesses of one type or another. Again, it's hard to know Hitler's mind at this particular point. And he's already thinking what will become Barbarossa. He, of course, authorized the preparations and a tremendous amount of preparation. I mean, you look at all the ships that were gathered, all the training that took place, modifying hundreds of tanks. This was a tremendous investment in resources at this particular time. It's hard to say that he would have allowed that to continue if he had not at some point been willing to do it. It wasn't completely out of the realm. Now, I have the traditional historical narrative has always been Hitler was never serious. It was all a front. It was all just to put political pressure on Churchill. It was a threat. It was just always going to be a threat just to try to make them capitulate, to bring Churchill to terms, to scare him, so to speak. He was never serious about it. The revisionist is much more kind of what I said. It doesn't make sense to have invested this amount of physical resources and this much of his military power to prepare for something that would not have taken place. He could have bluffed with a lot less if it was only a bluff. That would have been just as effective. So the revisionist idea probably in the last 10, 15, 20 years is, he probably at some point, it would have been his last resort, but he might have been willing to pull the trigger on this one way or another. Now, the other revision historical narrative is if he had tried it, it would have been a non-starter from the beginning. The RAF would have destroyed him. The Navy would have wiped him out in the Channel. A Panzer Grenadier would never have put his jackboot on Brighton Beach or something of that nature. But again, as more analysis takes place, more documents are revealed. There's more of an undercurrent that at least initially the first wave almost certainly would have successfully landed. That it would not have been stopped in any significant degree. The beachhead probably could have been consolidated. Probably, again, relative to some mistakes on one side or the other, the first operational objective given time probably could have been achieved. Having said that, that doesn't mean that England would have been militarily defeated. The first operational objective, you're still not to London yet. Assuming that they did not just collapse politically at that particular point, then most people, when they try to play this out in speculation, they think that it would have ground to a halt somewhere between the first and second operational objective. and it would have set the stage. There would have been some sort of political settlement between essentially Churchill and Hitler, because neither one could move the other one significantly militarily at that particular point. Right? So there would have come to some kind of an agreement, probably along the lines of Hitler would agree to withdraw his army in exchange for Churchill neutralizing the English Empire against Nazi Germany. What Hitler demanded at the beginning, you essentially neutralize you. You're never going to fight me from here on out. I'll leave you alone as long as you're demilitarized and you stay neutral, so to speak. That probably would have been something along the lines of a political settlement that both sides would have accepted. Now the other interesting issue for that is not so much those two countries, but if that had occurred, what would have the ripple effect been on later events in the war? Because at this time, the United States is still neutral. That means the U.S. probably never does what? Ever enters the European part of World War II. They would have no reason to. Because England is gone as far as being a springboard for an invasion. It's no longer the aircraft carrier just off the European coast. You cannot build up the Normandy forces. If you're going to have the equivalent of D-Day or the invasion of Europe, you have no England to do it from. I mean, and it probably wouldn't even been possible at that particular point to have accomplished that. So there's a question about whether the United States and Nazi Germany may never have actually been combatants against one. We may have not even entered the European part of World War II. Now, assuming Pearl Harbor still takes place, which it probably would have, 100% of our effort may have been in the Pacific War. And there never would have been an ETO for the U.S. So Hitler would have his empire, or he would be dealing with who? The Russians. He has his follow-on plans for the Soviet Union, but we may never have been involved. Don't know. Again, this is all rank speculation. You could, this is man in the high castle level stuff now that we're talking about. But it is fascinating. I think it is quite fascinating. But the possibilities later on, had England essentially dropped out of the war at that point, under whatever circumstances or conditions, had on our course of the war, are fascinating to think about. It definitely would have been different. So with that, I open the floor to any additional questions or any other comments on anything we talked about. Yes, sir.
A-Day, the Battle of Britain. Live. I'm thinking, obviously, if stunning success of Luftwaffe RAF, I think more momentum would have built up towards sea line. So where in there does that kind of fall? It started developing. We can't even generate local air security. So now we make a call this off. Does it matter beach or something?
Well, that's a very good question. How does the Battle of Britain sequencing and timing fit into sea line? Of course, at the beginning of August, or essentially in the first part of August, Goering gets the go-ahead, if you will, for Adlertag, the Eagle Day, where the initiation of the massive effort, bombing and so on, to attempt to draw the RAF fighter strength up and destroy it, which initiates that battle of attrition. So in the latter half of August, as we've seen, is when essentially the final compromise plan is beginning to coalesce up into the end of August, into the plan that we saw here. During this time, of course, Goering and the Luftwaffe are occupied in their own strategy to completely defeat England from the air, which obviously, as we know, did not work out. At the end, or probably about the middle of September, is about the time when it became clear to everybody that the Battle of Britain was going to be lost by the Luftwaffe. In fact, was it September 15th is Battle of Britain Day, I think, is the one that the British have as a holiday, the day we knew we won, essentially that kind of thing. Having said that, did the Luftwaffe have significant assets left to have then supported Sea Lion? Yes. They still had the potential resources to achieve temporary, localized air superiority over that particular part of the battlefield for the invasion. Yes. And again, as you saw by the aerial forces available to the RAF, really they had no dedicated, specialized anti-shipping aircraft of any type. The Spitfire and Hurricane are wonderful aircraft, but they can't sink ships. They can strafe, but that's about it. And as you saw, their bomber force was compared to later quite pitiful, actually. And they had no training in bombing anti-shipping campaign. Now the 10th Flieger Corps was highly specialized, and they were particularly trained in anti-shipping techniques. The Ju-88s with the dive bombing, they would typically come in at 500 feet or less on a ship and dive bomb a ship. They had practiced it and rehearsed it, and they were extremely proficient at it. And they had sunk a number of ships, British ships, prior to that time. They were a serious threat to the Royal Navy, particularly in the Dover Straits, that confined area. They would have racked up a pretty good number of Navy ships. The English had no equivalent to that whatsoever. I'm sure you've heard the stories about the early English bombing campaigns in Germany, where if they went at night, it was sometimes they couldn't even find the city they were supposed to bomb, and so on. The navigation was so primitive, and so on. And of course, they can only carry 4 250-pound bombs, which is a very light bomb load, and it's just Kentucky windage on the way down. So essentially, they were not I would not call them a significant threat to the invasion. So that plus the Luftwaffe making an honest effort at superiority, I think the RAF would have been almost a negligible factor in the invasion. Again, I'm speculating, but I go out there.
Were there any allies for the Germans involved in it?
No, none that I have found. None that I have found. As I said, on the English side, they did have the 1st Canadian Division was in country, and they had some New Zealander brigades had showed up. They also had a number of essentially refugee Polish units from the Polish campaign had managed to make their way to England, and they had enough to make a brigade, but they were completely without arms. It was just them. So again, they were in the same boat essentially as the Dunkirk evacuees. They had really no armament, but they would have had to been armed, so on. Now, no, the Canadians had their weaponry. They came complete. They had come complete, but they'd only been there a couple of weeks. They were just getting their feet dry, so to speak. But they formed part of Brooks' reserve. He had them in their GHQ reserve force. Of course, the other question is, what about the French? There's 100,000 French troops. Well, Charles de Gaulle at this time is just beginning, what he would call the Free French. His government in exile, as he called it, was just beginning to take form. And de Gaulle is in England, but he's just beginning this campaign to create what we call the Free French. At this very early stage, he's having a hard time finding followers. The vast majority of French soldiers and French citizens that he called to his colors, essentially, to fight with me in the Free French, not Vichy. Essentially, they ignored him at this early stage. Almost all the French soldiers that were there did not follow his banner, and they did not go to his colors. So only about 3,000 or 4,000 initially would fight with the British against an invasion. Now, later on, of course, as it goes on, of course, de Gaulle becomes more popular, and the Free French, gains adherence and becomes a movement. And pretty soon he has a division and 2, and so on. Of course, you know how that story plays out. But these early days, de Gaulle is a voice in the wilderness. He doesn't get very many people to follow him. So really, for this particular time period, the French are a non-factor.
You mentioned the terrain for the final plan. What were the beaches like? These cliffs, mountain terrain. I noticed slides that you had the Bergjager or mountain division.
Yes.
In the plan.
Mm-hmm.
So are they going to be forming cliffs? Or are they going to be, or why was it specialized need?
So
why were they needed? Why was it specialty?
Yeah. Well, there are some particular areas there that there is some significant terrain, but it's not like the cliffs of Dover, for example, things like that. Now, originally, if they had the A beach had stayed, then they would have dealt with a significant amount of that type of cliff, chalk cliff area. But the 4 beaches that they ended up having, there was relatively significant terrain behind the beachhead, but the beachhead themselves was pretty flat in that particular case.
So we're obviously we play this game at the company level.
Mhm.
You mentioned two companies for about 2 miles.
Approximately.
When we're talking about the thing that each have our 2 or so companies,
Mhm.
what does the British especially have in the way? You know, you hear about Winnie and Pooh, the coastal guns.
Mhm.
How many more coastal guns are they? Are they geographically dependent? Is it spread among? What can a British player with his 2 companies kind of expect out of it for his geography for defending that business?
Well, you would probably have beside in the beach area. Of course, this is dependent. It varies so much between different sectors and areas, if you will. But to just try to be notional about it. Again, you would have limited or no anti-personnel mines. You would have anti-tank mines of one type or another. But again, they take typically 300 to 400 pounds of pressure to set them off, if you will. You would have a limited amount of wire of some type and the beginnings of rudimentary beach obstacles. What they call admiralty scaffolding is the word that they use. Not located in all areas, if you will. Again, and then besides the actual troops, if you will, the companies that again would be behind that, then you had a certain number of coastal guns, particularly 6-pounders, more likely than not, were at various points along that area that were spread out typically by several thousands of yards. Now, the guns, unless they happen to be in some of the old, the Margate forts and so on, from left over from the Napoleonic period, these guns were on platforms, but they were typically unprotected. They're not in a casemate, they're not in a turret, they're open essentially. So, and their crews are open, so that makes them extremely vulnerable to air attack. So, if you have an invasion force that is supported by, say, Stukas or something that are able to fly in that particular area, those guns would have been immediate targets. Of course, that would have been a priority for the Germans for aerial attack of one type or another. So it's problematic to know how many would have survived in that particular area. So again, the defenses, when you really look at them, particularly you're talking right on the beach, they are very, very thin. Very, very thin. And in some cases, you would have had an English company facing an entire regiment coming ashore. Now, does that mean the Germans would have not suffered losses? Of course not. Some of them probably would have been heavily attrited. But of course, the Germans, of course, they were heavily attrited when they crossed the Meuse River, the river crossing there, and against much more formidable defenses that the French had on the other side of the Meuse. But they still managed to prevail and go through particularly with a lot of close air support by the Luftwaffe. So odds are definitely they would have overcome the beach defenses. I don't think there's any doubt about that. That help a little bit? Okay, great. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I hope you had a good time, and thank you. I appreciate it. Good. I hope you guys have a good exercise, a good game here. I hope it goes well for you. Thanks.